Welcome back to Pat Psychology Masters. It's been a couple of weeks since my last video. The last 2 weeks have been fairly hectic. For instance, I had a biopsychology exam on Monday, which was covering everything I learned the first 6 weeks, and I'm actually going to focus this video on one of the questions I answered in that exam. I'm also in the process of completing a social psychology assignment, which is a critique of a paper. The paper I chose to critique was a research paper that was written by authors from UCD and UCC Cork also, the lead author being Gillian Murphy, and it was for false memory generation during Ireland's abortion referendum. So make sure to tune into next week's video where I tell you more about my analysis of that paper. It's a very, very interesting paper. But for today's video, I'm going to focus on biopsychology, basically neuroscience, and I'm going to be telling you about the cerebral cortex. So the cerebral cortex is divided into 4 different parts. We have the frontal cortex, we have the occipital cortex, we have the temporal cortices, and we have the parietal cortex. These cortices, or different parts of the cortex, are named after the portion of the skull under which they feature. So when I'm talking about the cerebral cortex, I'm telling you about the outermost regions of the brain, basically the surface of the brain. So the surface of the human brain is highly folded, so it has a complex structure with a very large surface area. And a lot of our higher cognitive functions, so a lot of what makes us human, happens in these different parts of the cortex. So, for instance, our auditory processing and our language processing, it happens largely in the temporal lobes, and we're particularly good at language and at language processing. So we have quite a complicated temporal cortex in relation to other animals who have a less complex temporal cortex because they're not as adept at language as we are. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the temporal cortex. We see that in patients who have tumours of the temporal cortex, they typically suffer quite vivid hallucinations. And in patients who have a psychotic break, we can typically see very high activity in these temporal cortices, so the right and the left part of the brain. We have the temporal cortex. This tells us that activity here is implicated in hallucinations for people who are suffering with psychosis, or also in people who are taking psychedelic drugs. We're going to see higher activities in this part of the cortex. And this is in contrast, for instance, with a tumour of the occipital cortex or higher activity in the occipital cortex. So taking specifically a tumour in the occipital cortex, we typically will hear a patient describe experiences such as a flash of light. So a simple sensory experience, not something maybe as complex or as unusual as like a pink elephant in the room, which would be associated with higher activity in the temporal cortex. So that's just a very quick example of how the cortex is specialised in different regions for different things. A very interesting part of the occipital cortex is that it is described as retinotopically organised. This refers to the organisation of the occipital cortex in relation to our retina. The retina is basically the screen at the back of our eyes, which detects different changes of light and shade out in the outside world. So our retina bit is the part of our eye which receives visual signals. So in plain terms, this signal is transduced via the optic nerve, which actually crosses over in a part of the brain called the optic chiasm. These nerve fibres continue to the rear part of the brain, to the occipital lobe, and travel as far as the occipital cortex. Here, the occipital cortex is organized in such a way that it almost mirrors the organization of the retina. So remember how I said how the optic nerve crosses over to the other part of the brain. So on the left part of the occipital cortex, it relates to our retina in our right eye. So when we see, let's say, stimulation, like light stimulation in our right visual field, we can see activity in the left portion of the occipital cortex. So for instance, if a flash of light occurs in my right visual field, it will light up a corresponding part that's retinotopically organized, so that basically represents that part of the retina that was stimulated. I found that very interesting. Perhaps you might too. If you'd like to learn more about it, I advise you search the term Retinotopic Organisation. So that's the occipital lobe, and I briefly touched on the temporal lobes. The two other lobes are also incredibly interesting. Taking firstly the parietal lobe. So what separates the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe is what's called the central sulcus. So the central sulcus is like a deep fold in the middle of the brain, which goes from right across the middle to the left. In front of that central sulcus, so that central dip of the brain, we have what's called the post-central gyrus, which features in the parietal lobe. So it is positioned dorsally to the central sulcus. This gyrus, or it's like basically a crest, so the top of the hill, this post-central gyrus features the primary somatosensory cortex. This cortex is involved in receiving signals from the body in terms of where our limbs are in space, so proprioceptive information, and also touch information. So, for instance, when I touch my hands together, I will stimulate the portion of the somatosensory cortex which represents activation in the touch receptors in the tips of my fingers. This is organised in a similar manner to the retinotopic organisation of the occipital cortex. So there is a portion of my somatosensory cortex which is devoted to touch reception in the fingers, as well as the knees, as well as my chest, as well as my lips, as well as my ears. This is visually represented by what's called the somatosensory homunculus. Highly recommend you read up about this homunculus. It just is so fascinating. It's a visual representation of our somatosensory cortex and how much somatosensory cortex space is devoted to each portion of our body. And it gives you a very valuable visual representation of how much more sensitive different parts of our body are to touch and proprioception. So, for instance, the hands are very large of this somatosensory homunculus. The lips are very large, the ears are very large, because so much of that cortical space is devoted to the touch reception in those parts of our body. Those parts of our body are particularly sensitive to touch for exploring and feeling, and also knowing where our fingers are in space. So that's the post-central gyrus. We also have the pre-central gyrus, so the hill that comes anterior to that. The pre-central gyrus, which is anterior to the central sulcus, is our primary motor cortex. So this part of the cortex is responsible for initiating our voluntary movements. So when I move my right hand, there is a particular part of the primary motor cortex which is sending a signal through my brain, down through my spinal cord, out into my peripheral nervous system, and instructing me to move my hand and actually involved in that action of moving my hand. That's the pre-central gyrus the primary motor cortex. And there's a different homunculus which represents the organisation of that cortex and how much of it is devoted to different parts of the body. In the frontal cortex, we also have the prefrontal cortex, which is famous for its role in decision making and in thought. And if we damage this part of the cortex, we can see people's personalities change, the way they think changes, their ability to make decisions change. And a lot of our understanding of the cortex comes from such patients who've suffered extreme damage. For instance, Phineas Gage is a famous example. He was unfortunate enough to suffer a big, large piece of iron being blasted through his skull when he was working on the railroads in America. And he was very influential in developing our understanding for the regionalization of the brain and how certain regions are more involved in particular aspects of our behaviour than others. Another part of the frontal cortex that's very interesting to me is called Broca's area. Broca's area is typically located on the left-hand side of the frontal cortex, and it is involved in our ability to speak. So, Broca's area is definitely active as I speak to you now. Broca's area contrasts with a separate area which is related to language and speech, which is in the temporal lobe, typically on the left side, called Wernicke's area. Wernicke's area is involved in language comprehension, and typically damage to Wernicke's area involves people speaking very fluently but incoherently and basically speaking gibberish. You can see some kind of upsetting videos on YouTube of people with what's called Wernicke's aphasia, and these people, they just don't make sense. They babble, they speak, they talk nonsense. Words come out of their mouth, but there's no sense of meaning to what they're saying. And in contrast to Wernicke's aphasia, damage to Broca's area, which is referred to as Broca's aphasia, people do understand the language around them when they're being spoken to, and they want to speak and the words are in their mind, but they find great difficulty in speaking. And we often see people who suffer strokes having Broca's aphasia, having a difficulty in delivering speech. That was just a whirlwind tour of the cerebral cortex. There's an awful lot that I didn't talk about. If any of those particular aspects interested you, please leave a message in the comments. I can maybe focus on that a bit more in a future video and tell you a bit more. And as always, I encourage you to do some of your own research. And before I leave, I'd like to provide you a little anecdote. It reinforces my ideas about skepticism, which I've been harping on about for quite some time. The prefrontal cortex is a part of the cortex. It's a part of the outer area of the brain, and it's located prefrontally, so just posterior to the frontal cortex, just at the top around here. I have a degree in neuroscience. I didn't realise that up until 2 weeks ago. I thought the prefrontal cortex was something else. I thought it was not located on the cortex, but I thought it was located inside the brain and it was behind the frontal cortex. That's not the case. It is cortical space and it's just located pre the frontal cortex, on the cortex. I'd like to reiterate, I have a degree in neuroscience. That degree does not mean much. If you're an employer, that degree means everything and you should absolutely employ me. But if you're not an employer and you want to know the truth, that degree does not mean much. And when people tell you they have a PhD in whatever, that does not mean much. Judge people based on their actions and how they present their information and if they're convincing in their arguments. You don't win an argument by telling somebody that you have a degree in something. You don't really tell somebody much about yourself other than you spent time in college, you passed the exams. You don't really tell someone that you actually know the material. So Be skeptical when somebody tells you their credentials. See if they can back them up. And don't take everything I say as gospel. Always verify. And I think you should verify with everything you consume. Be it the news, be it popular news, be it scientific articles, be it politics. Be skeptical. That's it from me today. Be sure to like the video if you liked it, dislike it if you didn't like it, and subscribe if you haven't already. And check me out on Instagram as well. My handle is @PatPsychologyMasters, and I'll be sharing different neat content there in the coming months. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you here next week.